Welcome to Heads Up, the ISC Research series that keeps you informed of the latest trends happening in the international schools market. Let's get started with our episode. Today, we are shining light on what the broader international school community has learnt from the increased use of hybrid and blended learning methodologies, a topic we discussed with expert panellists at the ISC Research Edruptors School conference. Let's find out what challenges and opportunities go hand in hand with the rise of digital learning. We asked Philippa Wraithmell, a digital education specialist, author and educator currently residing in Abu Dhabi, what digital learning support is needed and available to the international schools community.
But it has to very much, from my perspective, be needs driven. So no matter what you're looking at in terms of those international schools, because they have students from all over the globe and from the country that they are residing in, I think we most importantly need to think about communication. And are the EdTech tools that we're using communicating in the right way with all of our stakeholders? So quite frequently we'll consider just the things that we're interacting with in terms of from student to teacher, which is obviously incredibly important. But then are we also thinking about our international community and the communities that we're supporting with that? So are we actually then thinking of the bigger picture? And is the information and the support network that we need to give to our parents also being communicated in the right way? And there are many different ways in which different schools are able to do that, including utilising things like accessibility tools within platforms to allow a range of different speakers and different nationalities to actually interact with your children's grades, within the feedback and assessment that they're getting, within the newsletters that you're sending out to the community. And every educator will know that having parents on side is such a huge part of being able to ensure that every child has the right appropriate needs being met and can actually interact and integrate within the lessons. I mean, we saw a huge part of that within the pandemic, where communicating across to parents the information they needed to allow their children to successfully integrate into online learning was a really big part of that. And I think so it's part of a bigger picture, and it's about, is your ecosystem of communication something that's useful for every single stakeholder?
Philippa highlighted the impact of blended learning methodologies on the whole school community, including teachers and students, but also parents of students. Podar International School in India is known to have embraced the use of technology, becoming a paperless school in 2004 and transitioning to digital learning methodologies. We talked to its principal, Dr. Vandana, Lulla, about the ways the school upskilled its teachers to deliver an effective digital learning approach during this period of transition.
We had to make sure that all the teachers are trained on the Microsoft Teams tools, all the various tools that are there, and then various other tools like Padlet, Kahoot, Google, all those tools that are required for teaching learning. Then we also created short videos, and posted them on our portal and gave training to the teachers on how you can make sure that you are effective in the classroom during the pandemic. And then we paired up. We had the buddy system, an expert and a person who was struggling, to make sure, again, they have the opportunity to go further. We created a tile on the Microsoft Teams known as Learning Zone, where all the resources were put, where everybody had an access to whatever materials that they need and they need to practice, they were stored on that Learning Zone where everybody had an access. So yes, we were integrating technology from a very long time.
Philippa touched upon the necessity to provide parents with a support network. We asked Vandana about how Podar International School involved parents.
So I think it's very important. We conducted a lot of induction programs. So every evening we had coffee evenings, we had coffee mornings, and we had a digital tool where you could book when you are available to do the training. So it's not that I told the parent, you have to come in the evening or you have to come in the morning. And we had a person in the school who was allotted to support parents, students, teachers. And at the admission counter, we have one person who's an expert in IT. So as soon as you come into the school and you take admission, you have an induction. You have an awareness of what's happening. So we have given step-by-step videos, we have made marks. So we keep doing that, and we have an opportunity for you to have a one-to-one training also.
It's interesting to hear how technology helps engage the whole school community, but what about learning opportunities? We asked Vandana about the benefits of using technology in delivering education. As we know, the implementation of digital learning was not just a solution in a period of crisis for Podar International School. We therefore wanted to understand if being adept with technology helped with the school's transition to digital learning.
The biggest benefit for the students for being paperless and going completely integrating technology into the whole school, right from enrollment, admissions to fees to education, everything through exams, was that children had access to all the resources needed for their learning. Parents had access, teachers had access anywhere, anytime. I think that was the key, and there was consistency in the whole school because everything was available to everybody and everything was there. So then came the pandemic.
However, despite being already proficient with technology, did Podar International School face any challenges during this period?
So yes, we had to adapt to the online mode. And when we had to adapt to the online mode, when we were moving to the pandemic, and that was something that we were looking at various subjects, various topics and the curriculum, and we felt that there is a need to kind of tweak the curriculum wherever required. We had to reduce the curriculum during the pandemic. So what we did was looked at various disciplines and looked at if there were any overlaps. So how do you integrate that overlaps and how do you make sure that the priority is given to the concepts that are important and maybe the overlaps are covered very clearly. So we had to tweak it a little kind of curriculum, but because we were a school that believed in technology for many years, we had to a certain extent kept the curriculum very digital friendly so that we could use it anywhere, anytime. So we had to then think of how we would help students who are at home. So when they're at home, it's different than what they're at school. So we had to come up with innovative hands-on activities with resources that are available to the children at home and what kits we could send home for children to use to be able to continue to learn at home and able to understand and develop their concepts and skills. So we came up with various strategies like problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning. We continued them, but we had to tweak that a little bit to make it more effective. And we used a lot of Google Drive to share the curriculum with the parent community more in depth with whatever changes that we made, and also that the teachers and parents could have access. Again, we would have regular meetings with the staff, horizontal meetings and vertical meetings to make sure that there is alignment of the curriculum, which is the key requirement. All the phases, they had vertical and horizontal meetings. And keep giving feedback. As you teach, we used to meet at a time given every day at 3 o'clock, a wrap-up time, where we used to have feedback. And then we used to get to know, oh, this didn't go well, this went well. How can we upgrade and update the curriculum as and when we teach or our pedagogy?
We also wanted to know potential challenges for school leaders from Philippa's perspective and what messages she would give to educators using technology.
So the first thing I would say to educators, especially within educational technology, is hook into your leadership now and start to build that strategy of what you actually want to be able to achieve and what does digital learning and the education system for your school look like within your environment. And then I think those people who are already there and do have the luxury of having one-to-one devices and having really great infrastructure and having that support network, potentially having digital leads, having people in every year group, etc. I think they're the people that really need to aspire and push for change now. It's that we can't stagnate, and it really is getting that blended approach that every student is still being catered for and being supported, but also that they are ensuring that we're interacting in the same way that we would do if we were all physically there or all physically online. And I know that definitely is an area where there has always been some struggle, because how many different ways can a teacher be split is quite difficult. In addition to that, I think student safety would be my next thing, and actually looking at and checking at systems, again, especially in the international market. We have so many different teachers coming from different areas, different standards that would be set, different acceptabilities and different things that we would be allowed to do, but also students coming from different backgrounds and different homes where, again, they're allowed to do different kind of sets and subsections of things. So one parent may be happy for a child to be able to do one thing and allow lots of device use at home, whereas another parent might not be. And actually being able to bring that together and outline the reasons why and be able to support your community by making sure that students are safe and that your teachers are safe, no matter where they are and where they're learning, would be my second point. And finally, I think staff and student needs. And there's a really big thing now around building capacity within our staff and making sure that they have the ability to be able to support students. And within that, it's students from every level. So for instance, something like special educational needs and disabilities can be so easily supported within digital learning and digital ecosystems, yet it's not something necessarily that every teacher has the skill set to be able to do. Whereas actually, if we start to build in these different elements of professional development and professional learning, you will not only see the students of determination, students of special educational needs and disabilities improve, but actually you start to give other students tools that can help them achieve even more.
What do international school leaders need to know and do to protect the whole school community in our global digital world? We understand the need to inform and train the community, but we specifically wanted to understand more about how schools can educate their entire community in cybersecurity. We spoke to Matt Harris, co-founder and CEO of ChildSafeguarding.com. We asked Matt if he could recommend a model for schools to achieve this.
When we talk about cybersecurity, we're really kind of talking about three things. There's a physical component, there's a logistical component, and then there's a personnel component. So as you're looking at who is going to lead the cybersecurity effort, you need to have people that can hit all of those spaces. So from a physical standpoint, there needs to be physical security for the IT. I mean, doors need to be locked, servers need to be put away. There needs to be some limitation to physical access to these devices or to this content that is well maintained within a school. And so the question then becomes, can the IT director do that? Maybe. I mean, that's something to figure out. In terms of the logistical pieces, there are those technological limitations and policies that get put in place that require, passwords that are reset every 6 months, or that have limited access to materials based on users. That's something the IT can do, but it needs to be done in a way that does not impede the operations of the organization and supports what needs to be accomplished. So again, who might know that? And then finally, the personnel piece that Bethan was talking about, there needs to be education. There needs to be regular education from the volunteers and the visitors all the way to the senior leadership to understand what the implications are of good practice, of we like to call digital hygiene. All of those need to happen. And so having one person that has a view to all of those things can be critical. So having a focus in those three areas across the board is going to be the best approach to ensure that everybody knows what they're supposed to do and is best prepared to protect themselves and the school.
Along with Matt, we spoke with Bethan Eveleigh, online education and safeguarding specialist and former head of quality and data at Inspired Education Online Schools. We asked her what issues within the online world and uses of technology within classrooms pose the greatest risk to children.
Yeah, so I've broken this down into two parts, the external and then the internal. So I know the external Matt's already touched upon, so you have things like the cyber attacks trying to access your data, you can have downloadable viruses, and I've also included an external, other people's behaviour in the online world. So you could have some very predatory behaviour out there looking to find students or vulnerable people. Internally, it's about the behaviour of your school staff and students. So you could have the sharing of inappropriate content, unprofessional communications, and they're not thinking about where they're sending them. So you could have some data or information being sent to sources that they shouldn't be. And as well, internally, you could have some student-to-student abuse happening, which could also start touching upon that. So a lot of the issues apart from your cyber attacks and that sort of external piece, are very similar to the things you would face in a normal face-to-face classroom. So I think there's a whole piece that needs to be done about teaching people within an educational setting about how to behave to stay safe. So the greatest risk from, I think, a practitioner's point of view would be downloading viruses onto your equipment, which could put you at risk. And also accessing public online spaces where there could be inappropriate behaviour or content that could be brought into the educational arena as well.
Both Matt and Bethan specifically highlighted how common cybersecurity issues arise from user practices. We asked Matt whether schools tend to look externally for issues rather than within the school itself.
Said kind of the blinders on the face is not recognizing that we have a lot of people internally that can be dangerous, that can have some malicious intent. And that typically comes around access to specific systems or access to specific data. And this is where that example becomes very clear. You know, students want to have access to various data things that they shouldn't have access to before. They want to circumvent some of those content items that Bethan was talking about. And they're good at it. They're going to figure out how to do these things. So we can't just look external to the walled garden. We have to understand who has access internally and what the risks are within those people that do have internal access to things, you know?
So, who should take responsibility for managing the internal and external risks to the school community's safety? Bethan shared her thoughts.
I think the message to international school leaders is it's everyone's responsibility. It's not just about the technological side, which is absolutely vital anyway, but we need to teach students and staff how to be safe online, especially as we start seeing like the metaverse come up. We have this whole new realm online that our students are going to enter in, and there's a really interesting piece around that about laws as well and what should or shouldn't be done. But if we don't teach our students to be safe, how can they be? They need that knowledge. So as educators, I think it's our fundamental job to prepare our young people for the world they are going to face when they leave school. And I think teaching them about technology and our virtual world is part and parcel of that.
Bethan also shared a few practices implemented at Inspired Education online schools to engage the whole community in cybersecurity.
So I think we're really very lucky that in comparison to a standard face-to-face school, we have a large IT team. So they're brilliant at having training, the right sort of training our staff need to know how to behave on their equipment and what to do there. Like I said, changing passwords frequently is a really important one. And they're also our first line of defense. So if they know something's happening, they have the knowledge to act really quickly on that. So teachers get trained by them. We also have ed tech teaching champions team, is the way I'd call them. So when we introduce new technology or new platforms, this lovely team of champions, they teach our teachers how to use something safely. Because when you enter into a new environment, you need the knowledge on what you're doing so you don't accidentally release information, even if it's not malicious, it might be completely accidental. It's better you're taught how to use it so you're safe there. And with students as well, we do the same. So we actually currently run a virtual reality club. So students who are interested in learning more about it can go and play with it in a safe environment guided by our teachers. And we also have training for them as well of what's good behaviour, what you should avoid. And if we're using with students external platforms, we use temporary passwords with them as well. So it means that they have that walled garden, you have access for a while, but then you don't need it anymore. So we're going to change that password to keep you safe as well. I think fundamentally knowledge is key. And we're sort of in a point in time at the moment where young people are what we'd call digital natives. So they grow up around technology. They feel safe in it because they feel that they know how to use it. So it's like this false sense of security that they can navigate through this world.
Despite the risk factors that exist in online environments, the opportunities that digital learning brings are very exciting. Students must be prepared for the world they will be living and working in. As our world is becoming more virtual by the day, how could virtual reality and the metaverse become fundamental learning resources of the future? We spoke with Dwayne Matthews, Head of School, Innovation and Partnerships at Ontario Virtual School, about the benefits of immersive learning for education.
I think with immersive learning, we now have another paradigmatic shift, and that allows us to do different things. And some of the things that I think that it'll allow us to do, not just content, but cognitive enhancement directly. So we would be able to enhance certain components of cognitive abilities, things like mental readiness, improving things like mental processing speeds, and even focus on IQ. So I think those are some of the bigger ideas that shift the form and the capabilities. Also, it allows us to connect with communities in much more meaningful ways through immersive gaming experiences.
So, virtual reality and the metaverse bring opportunities for an immersive, personalised and engaging approach to learning. With such potential, we asked Dwayne how school leaders can prepare their staff for this environment as a potential future for learning.
We used a set of tools to organize the strategy that we call school, because school is a societal strategy. And we've always used technology to do that, but what were we doing? And so the idea is to prepare students for the future and to contribute to the greater whole. And that job to be done, to quote Clayton Christensen, hasn't changed. It's still the same job. So when we look at virtual reality, we have to see this as it's a tool. It's a hammer. It's a screwdriver. And what we have to focus on is what particularly is the how. So I think the first order of business is that we get back to really focusing on what the purpose is of school. I know sometimes I ask people, I said, what's the purpose? And they say, oh, I'm here to teach kids how to read. I go, most students will teach themselves how to read. Sugata Mitra proved that a few years ago. There are lots of activities that do that. They're great apps that will sort of bring that into being. So really what we're thinking about is future preparedness. And I think once we take that aim with future preparedness, then we'll start to see practical applications. The other piece, I think, is to pay really close attention to how we adopt technology over time. The adoption, a lot of times, is substitution, right? So we have a smart board and it replaced the blackboard and we think this is really cool, but it's still the blackboard with the teacher standing at the front. The form remains the same. So as we move through, we should be very aware of where are we in terms of adoption. Are we substituting? Are we modifying? Are we augmenting? Or are we in transformation? And I think understanding that will allow us to pace ourselves in terms of roadmap, as opposed to, you know, a superintendent coming down from the clouds to say everybody needs to get VR headsets this September. I think if we have a successive roadmap, it's going to make for a much better transition. And the last piece, I would say, is to establish a red team, blue team strategy, where the blue team is looking at incremental improvements and the red team is really looking at going out into the future and seeing what that future looks like.
It's really interesting to hear this idea of using virtual reality as a tool to help prepare students for their future. Nathan O'Grady, the Learning Development Programme Champion at King's InterHigh, part of Inspired Education Group, extends Dwayne's idea of future preparedness.
So we're in a position now where this technology is known to everybody. And I think there's a really important factor here as well with schools, where even where schools aren't ready for the shift just yet, or perhaps aren't able to due to barriers like financial barriers, they should acknowledge and pay attention to the technology now, even if it's not putting it straight into their classrooms. And the reason why I say that is because, and I think I recall a conversation I had with Dwayne a week ago, we need to really focus on students' outcomes from school in the future when they finish their schooling, not what they might need in a society that's right now. Because as we know, technology will move on rapidly over the 10 years that students are in school. And so it's really important that teachers are paying attention to what is coming next, as well as what they can do now, so that students are prepared.
Nathan also showed how technology is in close alignment with the rules of the classroom.
But yeah, it is really important to understand that students have become accustomed to a certain way of interacting with technology. That means that we need to pay attention to this in schools as well. I think the important thing not to miss, though, and this is really critical, and I'm trying to get this across to peers all the time, is the fact that the rules of gaming are not so different to the rules of the classroom. What I mean by that is when you play a video game, you have an objective, you're given the requisite skills to achieve that objective, and there's often a period then of trial and error, improving your understanding of those skills, using those skills in different ways in order to achieve that objective, before then being given a more challenging objective and moving through the game to the ultimate goal. Now, if you start to describe to someone the process of what we do in the classroom over time, it's not different. In fact, it's almost identical. We give students a simple objective to begin with. We give them the skills to achieve that objective. We assess their completion of that objective, and then we give them a more challenging objective to challenge them to improve in their knowledge and education. So when you start to acknowledge that the tech is coming from this sort of arena and students are familiar with it, and the rules that students are familiar with are easily transferable to the classroom as well, it becomes apparent that this is not something that should be clashing. And this is often a mistake I think that some teachers make, not all, but some teachers make, is thinking that gaming is not a useful hobby and it clashes with the importance of education. If you start to see that they work in similar ways and you push students gently in the direction of using the knowledge they already have for games and obtaining the new knowledge that comes from education as a coherent thing, that can be really beneficial.
Will students be hindered if schools don't proactively adopt innovative technology? Nathan shared his views.
I think it's important to recognise that it is innovative, and therefore there is a very little research at the moment that can conclusively say whether there would be a hindrance or not by adopting it. By definition, if it's innovative, we haven't fully understood and utilised it yet to its full capabilities. However, the way I like to think of it is this. If you compare directly a classroom where students are doing a lesson perhaps on volcanoes, or let's say the moon or the planets in the solar system, you have to recognise the distinction between being able to show students a photograph or a video of a volcano or the moon, or taking students inside that volcano or taking them onto the moon for that lesson. And there's just such a change in level of what can be offered there using this immersive technology that it's difficult to ignore the fact that it's going to have clear benefits for the classroom.
Dr. Jeremy Williams, Vice President of Community for Monax Labs, a Web3 infrastructure studio, highlighted some practicalities schools need to take into account to adopt technology.
There's a lot of challenges around the ability to sort of adopt technology. And I think like one thing to call out in the international sector as well is that there's the sort of like internal intrinsic desire to adopt a specific set of technology for your school. And there's also the visage of what it looks like publicly to have this technology in your school. So, you know, like how does the VR headset or the set of VR headsets look for a parent who's going to tour the school? And I did it. And I know that is a conversation and a thought that leaders are having. And so I think it really has to get down to governors. It's got to get down to CEOs of school groups and parents to sort of get a really strong idea of what's happening here and thinking, is that shiny new VR lab going to get you further? Is it going to be just a substitution situation, is what Dwayne was alluding to earlier? Because I actually think that substitution can actually be harmful, because if you're going to have teachers spend an inordinate amount of time to learn how to implement a specific technology into the classroom, and it doesn't provide a value add for students, I would say it's probably not, I wouldn't even say it's a neutral scenario. I would say it's probably a harmful scenario. So I think like there's got to be a real conversation around what is the value add to pupils and students for having a certain specific set of technology in school. And maybe it is VR, maybe it's not. But I think a lot of it is also, where's the rest of your digital infrastructure in your school? Do you have proper Wi-Fi in your school? And some of these things, you know, I think people think like international schools, and they have this sort of idea that it's this like really, really, you know, super futuristic modern concept. And I can tell you that there are a lot of international schools that don't have functioning Wi-Fi. And so we need to get the infrastructure level right first, and then think about some of these other assets.
Could immersive learning bring us closer to each other, or rather pull us further apart? We asked our panelists.
I think the immersive allows us to see each other. Many of the challenges that we have is because we can't see each other. we can't experience what each other is experiencing, and we don't know what that world is like. I don't know what's happening in the West End of Toronto in that particular area, and I don't know what's happening in the Bridle Path in Toronto, which is probably our most expensive area. I don't understand what happens in those people's worlds. And so as we grow up, there's this disconnect. And so I think we see that sort of expand across the globe. And I think there's a real opportunity in terms of immersive to connect those and interact in a much more meaningful way that we haven't had before. And I think those decentralized schools have an opportunity to connect back in with other groups, much like we've seen with the GitHubs of the world, much like we've seen with some social media platforms.
I think if anything, it's really facilitated some human interaction from what we've seen. So for example, we take on some students that are perhaps not so confident in themselves. They may have found that they had difficulties in physical schools, and so the online school is a little bit more accessible to them inherently, for that matter. What we do find sometimes is in using a virtual classroom on a desktop works really well. We've got things like a Q&A box and a chat box, much like this chat has today, so that students that don't want to speak on microphone have an option to interact that they wouldn't normally have in a classroom, which is really good for those students. But actually, there's an interesting factor of having students in a virtual space together where they're not physically present in front of their peers. It seems to remove some level of fear for having those social interactions. So although they are still a person stood in front of another person, because they don't have the divide, because they do have the divide of that person not being physically in the space with them, but they can see them and interact with them, it gives some of those students more confidence to have an interaction that they might not have if they were physically face-to-face. So I think I can see your point from perspective of, generally speaking, does turning everything social into being everything virtual cause harm? And yes, it probably does. But for some folks that have anxiety or other mental health barriers to communicating in that standard physical way that most of us might find familiar, it's a real opportunity for them to engage on their terms with people in a pseudo-physical space instead. So I think with all of that in mind and all of the opportunity that this brings, and that's really just like a pinch of salt from the pile of opportunity that VR and other immersive technologies can bring to the table for accessibility, the message to leaders in education or suppliers around the world is not to sleep on this technology and not to fear the change, but to embrace the opportunities that it can bring to a wide variety of people, whether they are young or old or wherever they might be in the world, to overcome barriers that might have been an issue for them for many years in the past.
What an inspiring comment to conclude our episode. A call to action for international school leaders and suppliers. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. For more information about Heads Up, including access to previous episodes, please visit iscforschools.com/headsup. Until next time.